Where is China going? It is the season to ask this big question. The two sessions are being held: the National People's Congress, the NPC, and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, the CPPCC. Will China's economy continue slowing? To what extent are leaders committed to administrative reform? Will social imbalances improve? And what about China's more assertive foreign policy? I try to envision China's future as a series of challenges. That's one way to get closer to China. To know where China is going as a country is to confront the challenges of change in every sector of China's nationhood and statecraft. China's development has been astonishing. China's economy is now the second largest in the world, doing in decades what elsewhere took centuries. But dramatic changes causes pervasive problems, and China is confronted with contradictions and challenges. How to sustain the country's development in an era of lower new normal growth and an economy needing new rounds of reform. How to weigh the benefits of industrial growth against the problems of pollution and pressures of climate change. How to continue to increase standards of living in a society of increasing demands, high expectations, and deep imbalances. How to enhance rule of law to promote fairness and root out corruption to protect the party. How to conduct foreign policy that defends China's core interests while assuring the world of China's peaceful intent. These are just some of the challenges that China must face and the questions that China must answer. The world wants to know where China is going, and so do the Chinese people. What would be reforms that, unless they occur in the next 5 years or 10 years, whatever the time, you would be unhappy? You'd say, you know, we are not doing well because those reforms didn't happen. What are the critical reforms that you need?
No, I think perhaps the most important reform in the political domain, I mentioned that, is how to really build a first-rate mechanism for selecting competent, well-rounded, leaders. That's important. After all, we had, Zhou Yongkang, competent but corrupt. How to avoid this kind of problems. In the economic domain, the most important reform would be how to really draw the clear borderline between the state and market. Sometimes still not clear, so this is crucial. In the social domain, it's about pension reform. It's about medical insurance. It's about educational reform. Many initiatives are out there, but we still to see the result. For instance, the latest proposal of reform in the education system is about college entrance exam, which affects every family. The new proposal is called the 3+3. You have the exam test for mathematics, Chinese language, and foreign language. That's 3 are compulsory. And then you can choose from any subjects, 3 subjects for examination. So that, try to take care of your individual interests rather than the old practice, which you have to go through 6 exams, 6 subjects. You have no physics, you have to go through that. So great idea. But whether it will be good or not, we will see. So just an example to show this kind of reforms.
From the actual citizens in urban areas, which is 40%, and ultimately reaching 75%, that's 35% of the population, which is more than three times the size of Japan,
Yeah.
that in essence will be moving into cities, generating the growth. And that is that what enables 20 years potentially of growth in the 7% range.
中国现在这样一个城市化的过程，很多的国外的商人、学者和政府官员都非常关注。也就是说，中国这个人口体量很大，虽然这个比例看起来并不是很高，和一些发达国家相比，但是它每一个百分点都意味着中国1000多万人从农村转移到城市啊。从社会学来讲，它还带来了一个职业结构的变化，也就是大量白领或者在西方我们叫 middle class 啊，中产阶级的产生。过去我们主要靠出口和投资，特别是投资，大量的投资拉动了中国的经济。那么现在投资和出口对经济的拉动作用都在下降，所以未来主要的一个可能要靠我们要转变成一个像其他大的经济体一样，像美国、日本、德国，就是国内的消费成为拉动经济一个主要力量。而在这个消费力量当中，一个最主要力量，现在我们经过研究就发现，就是中产阶级，这个 middle class， 因为它的这个消费弹性大。所谓消费弹性，就是说，它每增加，比如说100美元的收入，可能用于消费的这个比重是比那些富人和穷人都高的。对于富人来说，他虽然很有钱，但是他的消费已经基本上饱和。但是对于穷人来说，他需要消费，但是他又没有钱。所以如何使这个中产的阶级这一块能够大规模的增加，这也是城市化过程当中一个很重要的一个命题。所以这些人从哪里来呢？那么从其他国家的经验来看，一方面是从新生的这个大学生毕业的学生里边来，另一部分很重要的就是中国的这个农民工，就是我们要使这个农民工里边相当一部分未来要依靠他自己的人力资本，他的技术，而能够使他上升成达到一个中产阶级的生活水平。如果能够实现这一点的话，中国就确实能够实现这种发展方式的转变和整个消费结构的这种实现一个大的飞跃。
Some would argue today that economic growth is much more difficult than it was in the past, because in the past, in rural reform, you just sort of had to let the farmers do what they wanted to, and it just happened. And then the great revolution in the industrial sector was cheap manufacturing. Chinese workers are hard workers, they're skilled, you pay them very little, small capital, you could be, with a huge population, the world's manufacturing base. Nothing is easy in business, but that was a way. But now, when you have to increase the quality of companies, increase the gross margin, get other kinds of things other than cost benefit, it's much more difficult. So reform today is much harder than it was before.
This is natural, because all the easy reforms have been carried on, in the beginning, and followed by the difficult ones. Think about what happened in the middle 1990s, where there was so much loss-making facing the Chinese manufacturers, especially in the state sector. It's difficult actually to carry on the structural reform at that time. But I think that would require the commitment, strong commitment of the government, because you need to definitely address that structural problems by carrying on the state-owned reforms, get this getting the state sector small, get rid of the small state-owned enterprises and remain control over the gigantic firms or something like that. Well, it did, and it's been quite successful. This is a quite successful way of solving the structural problems at the time. So the loss-making problems have been, addressed. So looking forward, I think China is going to facing a lot more difficulty today, in carrying on some of the structural reforms. Because, for instance, the state-owned enterprises today are not a loss makers, where they actually profit-making, gigantic firms. How do you actually make them more efficient? Same time, you're going to, getting them away from the monopolized positions, for instance, in the upstream industries. This is not easy to do because any of the countries today in the world are facing the problems of the big firms, because the big is too big, to fail. So how did you manage them? How did you actually, discipline them? That's the universal issue. It's just not the issue of the Chinese case. I mean, because we can learn from the successful cases from another country, but it doesn't mean that you could get this problem down overnight. So you're going to taking a lot more time. I mean, to carry on this structural problem in the future.
What are other categories of economic reform that needs to happen in the coming years?
I think financial reform, which is a very, very important areas, of the reforms in the future. Because, today, I think that the very important issues which constrain the Chinese economic growth in the future will be the allocation of the financial resources in an efficient way. Because China didn't really develop its capital market. It wasn't as efficient as the United States, for instance. So the banking system today is still the main, financial system in China who carry on the financial resources to allocate them. This is not an efficient way because there's so much financial resources being devoted to some of the areas which created so much bubble today, rather than really support the development of technology, for manufacturing themselves.
How about in the economic sphere with state-owned enterprises? What kind of reforms are critical there?
At this particular stage, I noticed there are a few areas where the government lays emphasis. One is to allow individuals to start their own businesses far easier than ever before. Mm-hmm. So basically it's a decentralization, it's a deregulation, so that you can start up your companies. In the past, you need to start a company, you have to have, 30, 40 stamps of approval. Now one, or it's within one room or one building, one service. So it's this is one major reform. It's being carried out, which is wonderful. Yeah. And the other is the state-owned enterprises. Basically, there is an interesting attempt to delineate the borderlines between state-owned enterprises and private enterprises. Strategically, if you look at this whole issue from the China model perspective, the state sector plays certain functions and private sector plays certain other functions, and these two functions should be complement to each other. That's ideal line of thinking, which will stay. But in reality, sometimes it's more mixed. Sometimes the gain for state sector would be loss for the private sector, and vice versa. So now the new line is essentially for those which market can take care of better, we give them to the market. I'll give you an example. This oil business, which is essentially controlled by the state-owned enterprises. But with reforms, we try to say, look at other businesses within the oil sector, for instance, petrol stations, which can be privatized, which can offer better service. So now this reform has started. Many petrol stations are privately owned. Just an example. Even within the state sector, you can divide those market-oriented sector and those strategic sector controlled by the state.
If you look ahead 10 or 20 years into the future, what would be your hope or expectation of the state of rule of law in China?
20年后的中国，我理解应该是中华民族的2个100年的计划已经完成了，这个是一个很美好的一个愿景。从法治来说，我觉得一个是中国真正是法治真正变为管理治国理政的一个基本方式，就是法律是最高的准则。第二个，全民族都能够自觉地遵守法律。第三个，遇到问题都有个公正的裁决。这样可能我觉得到20年，我觉得问题不大。因为一代人嘛，我们现在公民法治社会的建立，公民法治观念的培养，一代人也差不多。
To take a name people use, Zhou Yongkang, he was in very powerful position for several decades, culminating with the person who ran law enforcement and security for the whole country for 5 years. And so basically, if it is now said that he is a bad leader, was a bad leader, and one had to wait to this whole period of time for a change of leader.
There's no perfect political system, right? So if the political system has mechanisms in place to identify and punish bad leaders in a way that is different than competitive elections, then that might be enough to ensure legitimacy for the system. If the system is viewed as totally biased politically and we're only going after our political enemies, then that, I think, will undermine the legitimacy of the system. So the efforts to identify and punish bad leaders needs to be relatively transparent and as kind of objective as possible.
How would you characterize President Xi Jinping's approach to the international order, the international structure, and how might that differ looking forward as compared to previous generations?
第一个，我觉得习近平担任这个国家主席以来啊，他在这个外交上有很多这个新的这个一个举措啊，但是我觉得我看我们国家的这个内政也好，外交也好啊，他一代一代的这个领导集体啊，在这个大的政策方针上，它其实有很强的一个连贯性，这是我们国家政治这个很重要的一个特点啊。那么当然在这个外交上，那个2013年应该是我们讲3月份，那么习近平担任这个国家主席以来，现在不到2年的这个时间那个他如果我们算一算的话，他出访的时间将近90天时间，将近90天，就是很多这个说明这个外交在他的整个这个治国理政里面占据很重要的一个位置，是吧？那同时也说明这个中国发展到这个阶段了，到这个地步了，那么外交在我们国家这个国家治理里面呢，越来越重要啊，所以我觉得这是一个他就是担任国家主席以来，在这个外交方面呢，这样的一个跟以往这个领导可能有个不一样的，因为我们讲以往的领导在担任这个国家领导人以后，这个2年时间里面，出访时间那么多跑遍的地方也是跑的地方也很多，这是很少的，所以这是一个可以看到的很有意思的一个现象。
As China is developing and has what is described in China as a peaceful rise, why is it the case that there are many foreigners in many countries, not just media, but diplomats and common people, that really fear a rising China?
就不能说这个外国人是怕中国的这样的一个崛起，或者害怕中国的这个模式也好害怕这个中国崛起也好，我觉得这个第一个呢，中国它本身这个国家规模大，块头很大，那么任何这样大的一个国家， 规模这么大的一个国家，那么在国际政治里面，它都是属于非常特殊的这个这样的一种现象。那么这是第一个。那么第二个，其实呢，看中国啊，一定要看它的历史。第二个呢，看它的这个实践啊。我觉得呢，通过历史和实践来看的话呢，其实外界没必要担心中国啊。为什么这么讲呢？你看这个中国这个就新中国成立以来吧，啊，或者我们讲就是这个改革开放以来吧，这个30多年啊，那么中国的它自己实现自己的这个发展，它从来或者很少把自己国内的这个压力给转嫁到国际上去，啊，它一般是通过什么呢？或者最主要是通过内部自我消化的方式，来消化这个发展过程中所碰到的这个各种问题，那么包括这个制度创新的这个方式啊。那么所以你看这个中国它没有把自己内部的这个发展过程里面出现的很多这个压力啊，通过这个外交转移到这个国际体系里面去啊。那如果我们做对比这个西方早期在这个18、19世纪甚至20世纪初的话，那它发展过程里面出现的很多问题是通过外交方式转移到这个国际政治里面去的。那么其实对其他国家其实造成很多这个不好的这个影响。但你看对比起来，中国的话在这方面呢是通过内部这个自我消化的方式啊，通过内部这个制度创新的这个方式来处理这个问题啊。我认为这是呢就是中国模式啊在这个外交层面它一个很重要的一个内容。那么第二个，其实如果你看这个实践的话啊，实践，那么从实践这个层面来讲，那么中国它其实我们讲这个和平发展这样的一个这个战略啊战略。那么从实践层面来讲，我们是怎么来跟其他国家通过这种互利合作，通过这种合作共赢的方式或者通过这个更多的通过谈判，更多通过这个协商的方式来解决这个问题啊，解决很多跟其他国家这样的一个在发展过程里面出现的这个问题。所以我觉得从实践层面来看，其实外界他也没必要就担心中国这样的一个发展。
How do you see it? What are the difficult reforms that need to be attacked now?
I can give you a specific example. For instance, people talk about vested interests. Now, you can see the whole population, vast majority, have certain kind of vested interests. Take the real estate market as an example. Thanks to reform, most Chinese now become property owners. Yeah. In the countryside, it's 100%. In the cities, it's 85%. So even a taxi driver owns a property. It's remarkable, it's wonderful. But at the same time, if you look at internet, the new media, all kinds of complaints, rightful complaints about housing price, too expensive. For young generation, they cannot afford. And then home ownership is a part of Chinese tradition. The government said we should reform. We start with registration of real estate. So far, this real registration is there, but it's chaotic. Different provinces use different systems. There are no nationwide data bank, whatever. So they want to introduce this. It will take 4 years. But this is not easy because for a long time, for many years, people are debating about this. Those who have a lot of property said, we don't need this, we reject this. And they will say, if there is this kind of registration, then housing price will go down and that will hurt Chinese economy. So here you do have the people with properties and people with a lot of properties and people with no properties. So their interests should be taken care of. Yeah. And of course, this is still at the stage of registration. Next stage is more controversial. To what extent we should levy real estate tax. Today, in China, the maintenance of properties is so cheap. Yeah. That's why many people buy many properties. But with this kind of reform, if it leads to a sharp decline of property price, then it's also called problem for the Chinese economy. So
it's balanced, but young people would be benefited by
Yeah,
lower prices that
that's
are more
true.
balanced with
Yeah.
real estate taxes, etc.
same with the household hukou reform. You have urban citizens who are relatively better looked after, and for you don't have enough schools, for the new
Hospitals,
migrants,
schools.
hospitals. So there's also vested interest versus newcomers. So the government tried to introduce reforms. Yeah. The state sector plays certain functions, and private sector plays certain other functions, and these two functions should be complement to each other.
What are the key factors in reducing the ossification, your word, in Chinese society?
Partly it's providing more economic opportunities for the disadvantaged people. So this whole thing, it's true that the farmers now have less chance to succeed at Tsinghua, but the proportion of farmers in society is much lower than it used to be. And now with this increased trend towards urbanization, one would expect even less of that. So the government has to pay special attention to providing economic opportunities for the disadvantaged and for people from farming backgrounds and so on. No doubt about that, if they're serious about meritocracy. But there's other things too, other ways to prevent ossification. And one problem with a well-functioning meritocracy, on the one hand, the system should be transparent, and there should be one system for getting into the system and for being promoted and so on. But on the other hand, things change so fast, and sometimes there might be new needs and requirements in society which could be dealt with by somebody from outside the system. So for example, if there's a need for like a very brilliant young person who knows how to deal with high tech and how to take the new technologies and to use them for philanthropic ends, somebody like that, you might have to pick them and put them and give them a leading political role. Reserve a minority of spots for people from outside the system. That way is important.
China's affirmative action.
Right, affirmative action, but here is for people with political talent who don't rise from within the system. I think that's very important. There's a bit of that now, but arguably there's going to be more of a need for that in the future.
How to assess China's future. Here are a series of challenges. In economics, can urbanization enable China to sustain growth rates around 7% for many years? Assuming more than 400 million farmers will become urban citizens, it probably can. In politics, what kinds of reform boost transparency, credibility, and efficiency and fit the China model of governance? One meaningful innovation is that all ministries must now make public their responses to public interest motions and proposals raised by lawmakers in the NPC and advisors in the CPPCC. In social issues, farmers and migrant workers seek to upgrade their access to quality health care and education. Pollution and rule of law also come high on the civic agenda. In foreign affairs, China has grown more sophisticated in dealing with complex issues and less troubled, it seems, with regional disputes. For example, President Xi Jinping's Silk Road Strategic Initiative engages 50 to 60 countries in economic development and other forms of cooperation. We have entered a period crucial for systemic reform. Checking China's challenges keeps us closer to China.